Arthur Penhaligon loved silence. Not the absolute, vacuum-like silence that presses on your eardrums, but the living, breathing silence of an old house. A silence filled with the faint sighs of settling beams, the distant hum of city traffic like the roar of an ocean, and the steady, calming tick-tock of the antique clock in his study. This silence was the canvas on which he painted his life. Ordered, predictable, and most importantly, controlled. His apartment, located on the third floor of a stately brick building in a quiet Boston neighborhood, was his sanctuary. High ceilings with cracked plaster molding, wide oak floorboards polished to a dull sheen by decades of footsteps, and large windows overlooking a tree-lined street, all of it created a sense of stability and peace. Arthur was an architect, a man for whom lines, space, and structure were not just a job, but the language the universe spoke. And his apartment was a perfect sentence in that language. At 42, Arthur was alone, but he didn't feel lonely. He had chosen this path consciously. Relationships were too chaotic, too unpredictable. They introduced variables into life that couldn't be calculated. Work, books, a collection of rare vinyl records, and an evening glass of whiskey, that was enough. He was the captain of his own ship, and the sea remained calm. That Tuesday evening, it all began. Outside, a September rain drummed lazily against the glass. Arthur sat at his massive mahogany desk, bent over the blueprint for a new country house. The lamplight carved his focused face out of the room's gloom, highlighting the silver threads in his dark hair and the long, slender fingers clutching a pencil. The clock struck 11. That was when he heard it for the first time. It wasn't a sound so much as the shadow of one. A light, barely audible rustle that seemed to come from the long hallway connecting the study to the living room. Arthur froze, lifting his head. The pencil hovered over the paper. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was intermittent and quick, as if someone had run a few steps across the wooden floor barefoot. Too light for an adult. Too wet? Mice, he decided instantly. Old houses were a haven for rodents. Annoying, but perfectly explainable. He'd have to call pest control tomorrow. The man shrugged and tried to return to his work, but the perfect geometry of the lines on the drawing no longer held his attention. The silence in the apartment had changed. It had become tense, full of anticipation. After listening for several minutes, he noticed nothing more. Only the steady beat of the rain and the ticking of the clock. Sighing, Arthur put down his pencil. He decided he needed a break. Walking to the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water. The light over the sink was harsh and cold. His gaze swept over the impeccably clean steel surfaces, the gleaming tile. No signs of pests. No disorder. Returning to the study, he sat down at the desk again, but instead of working, he just stared into the dark opening of the hallway. A sense of unease, illogical and irrational, settled somewhere beneath his ribs. An hour passed. The rain had almost stopped. Arthur had already convinced himself that he had just imagined it, a trick of a tired mind or the creaking of old water pipes. He was just about to turn off the lamp and go to bed when the sound repeated. This time, it was louder, more distinct, and closer. Slap, 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 slap. It was a quick, almost panicked run. The sound of bare, wet feet running across his oak floor. It started near the living room entrance and stopped abruptly somewhere halfway down the hall. Arthur jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. The crash of the fallen chair seemed deafening in the ensuing silence. His heart hammered in his chest like a trapped bird. This wasn't mice. And it wasn't pipes. The sound was absolutely, unmistakably recognizable. It was the sound a child makes after jumping out of the bath and running through the house. But there were no children in his house. There never had been. Arthur stood motionless, listening to the silence, which now felt ominous. Every nerve in his body was stretched to its limit. Slowly, trying not to make a sound, he reached for a heavy bronze paperweight shaped like a lion's head from the shelf. The cold metal was unpleasant against his sweaty palm. "Who's there?" His own voice sounded hoarse and foreign. There was no answer. Step by step, hugging the wall, he moved from the study into the hallway. The moonlight, breaking through the clouds, painted pale rectangles on the floor from the living room windows. The parquet floor gleamed dimly. It was completely dry. Arthur peered into the living room. Empty. The shadows of the furniture lay on the floor like sleeping beasts. The kitchen. Empty. The bedroom. Empty. The bathroom. He pushed the bathroom door open. It was dark and quiet inside. Flipping the switch, he squinted against the bright light. White tile, gleaming chrome, a large mirror over the sink reflecting his own pale, frightened face. Everything was in its place. Dry and clean. He searched the entire apartment, looking in every closet, behind every curtain, under the bed. No one. The front door was locked with 2 deadbolts and a chain he had personally fastened 5 hours ago. The windows were closed. No traces. No explanations. Returning to the living room, Arthur sat in an armchair without turning on the lights. The paperweight was still in his hand. He looked at the dark corners of his apartment, his sanctuary, and for the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger in it. A guest in his own home. The silence returned, but it was no longer the silence he loved. It was predatory. It was hiding something. And Arthur knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was not the last time he would hear those footsteps. He sat in the darkness and waited. He waited until the first gray rays of dawn painted the sky outside the window, turning the ominous shadows back into familiar furniture. He never fell asleep. The morning brought a fragile sense of relief. In the cold, impartial light of a new day, the night's fears seemed absurd, the product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. Arthur stood in the middle of the hallway with a cup of black coffee in his hand, his gaze methodically scanning every inch of the parquet floor. Dry. Impeccably clean. Not a single trace. Auditory hallucination, he diagnosed himself. The brain is a complex mechanism. Sometimes it glitches. An old house creaks, pipes groan, and the tired mind of an architect, accustomed to precision, fills in the rest. He even chuckled at his own foolishness. Running around his apartment with a paperweight like the hero of a cheap horror movie, Arthur forced himself to follow his routine. A shower, a shave, a perfectly ironed shirt, the drive to the office. Work was his salvation, his fortress of logic. He immersed himself in calculations, blueprints, and client meetings. The world of concrete, glass, and steel obeyed the laws of physics. There was no room in it for the sound of bare, wet feet where they could not possibly be. But by evening, on his way home, Arthur's confidence began to fade. He noticed he was deliberately driving slower, delaying the moment he would have to put the key in the lock. The building's entrance doors seemed heavier than usual, the stairs to his third-floor apartment steeper. Entering the apartment, he felt it again. A change in the atmosphere. The air felt thick still. The silence was no longer calming. It was waiting. Arthur walked through the rooms, turning on the light in each one, as if trying to banish the darkness from the corners. Everything was in its place. But the feeling of another's presence, invisible and unheard, did not go away. He tried to distract himself. He put a Bach record on the turntable, poured himself a whiskey. But the music couldn't drown out the tense silence between the notes. The man sat in his armchair, staring at the unlit hallway, and every creak of the floorboards made him jump. Night came quickly. This time he didn't work late. Arthur went to bed at 10, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. He lay under the covers, dressed in his pajamas, and listened. He listened to the house breathe. The ticking of the clock in the study seemed deafening. Around 11:30, it started again. Slap. A single, distinct sound. Very close. Right outside his bedroom door. Arthur froze, afraid to breathe. His heart skipped a beat, then began to pound with furious force. Slap, slap, slap. Slower than yesterday. Unhurried. As if someone small and curious were exploring the hallway. The footsteps moved from his bedroom toward the living room. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, Arthur sat up in bed. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His rational mind desperately clung to explanations. The upstairs neighbors? No, they had thick carpets, and he had never heard them so clearly. A leak? But the sound was intermittent. These were footsteps. There was no doubt about it. And then he heard a new sound. A faint, barely perceptible scraping. It was coming from the living room. Fear battled with anger inside him. Someone or something was in his house, in his sanctuary. The thought was unbearable. Tossing off the blanket, he tiptoed to the bedroom door and pressed his ear against the cold wood. The scraping repeated, louder this time, as if someone were scratching something hard. He yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. A dim night light, which he always left on, was glowing in the living room. Silence. Arthur stepped into the hallway, his bare feet feeling the cool parquet. Taking a few steps toward the living room, he scanned the shadows. And then he saw it. Right under the window, on the very spot where the moonlight fell on the floor, lay one of his precious vinyl records. It was a rare jazz album he had bought at an auction. It had been pulled out of its sleeve and thrown on the floor, and on its black, gleaming surface, in the dust that the daylight hadn't caught, were scratches. Rough, chaotic lines, as if someone had tried to draw something without the strength or skill to do so. But it wasn't the scratches that made his blood run cold. Next to the record, on the smooth surface of the oak floor, was an imprint. Small, wet, and perfectly clear. The imprint of a child's bare foot. The water was already beginning to evaporate, but the outlines were unmistakable. 5 tiny toes and a small heel. Arthur stared at the footprint, and his entire world, built on logic and order, collapsed. This was proof. Undeniable. Physical. He was not alone in his apartment. And his guest was a child, or something that wanted to seem like one. Arthur didn't move, afraid that the slightest motion would destroy this fragile, terrifying piece of evidence. He knelt, his eyes fixed on the footprint. The wood around it felt damp to the touch, and a faint chill emanated from it. There was no smell of swamp water, or chlorine, or anything else that might offer a clue. It was just water. Cold water. From where? He looked up again, scanning the ceiling, the walls, the frames of the tall windows. No drips, no signs of a leak. There was no source. With a trembling hand, he took out his phone. The screen blinded him for a moment. Opening the camera, he took several pictures of the footprint from different angles, like a forensic expert at a crime scene. As he focused, he noticed the wet print was fading, its edges losing their sharpness. The water was evaporating right before his eyes. In a few minutes, all that would be left of the print was a faint, darkened spot on the varnish, which could be blamed on anything. Disappearing evidence. Clues that melted away like snow. He left the record on the floor. To pick it up, to touch it, felt like a desecration. This object, a part of his orderly collection, now belonged to another world. It had been marked. Arthur spent that night in the armchair in the living room, with every light in the apartment turned on. He didn't drink whiskey. He didn't listen to music. He just sat, armed with a heavy poker from the fireplace, and watched the darkness beyond the windows, feeling besieged in his own fortress. But nothing else happened. No sounds, no footprints. It was as if the uninvited guest, having left its calling card, had departed, satisfied with the effect it had produced. At work, he was a shadow of his former self. Colleagues cast worried glances his way. He missed their words, unable to concentrate on the blueprints. The lines that had once been a source of order for him now seemed like meaningless scribbles. In his mind, there was only one geometry, the perfect shape of a small, wet footprint on his floor. Arthur left the office earlier than usual, but he didn't go home. Instead, he drove to a large supermarket, to the electronics department. Feeling like a paranoid fool, he bought a small wireless camera with a motion sensor and night vision. Then, in the grocery aisle, he picked up a large paper bag of all-purpose flour. He had a plan. If the logic of this world no longer applied, he would apply his own. Back in the apartment, he acted methodically, like an architect planning a defense. He locked the front door, checked all the windows. Then he opened the bag of flour. With a thin, even line, he sprinkled the flour across the hallway at the entrance to the living room, creating a perfect white barrier. Nothing could cross it without leaving a trace. He set up the camera on a bookshelf, aiming the lens at the flour-dusted section of the floor and the far end of the hallway. Connecting it to his laptop, he brought up a live feed on the screen. In the black and white night vision image, his apartment looked alien and sinister. The white line of flour shone like a border between worlds. His preparations complete, he took refuge in the bedroom. He left the door ajar just enough to see the hallway, but he himself remained in the shadows. He sat on the floor, his back against the bed, and placed the laptop in front of him. Now, all he had to do was wait. The clock on the bedside table showed 10, then 11, then midnight. The silence in the apartment was thick and heavy. The only sounds were his own breathing and the distant ticking of the clock from the study. He was already beginning to doubt his idea, feeling foolish. And then he heard it. It wasn't the patter of feet. It was something new. A quiet, melodic humming. An innocent children's tune, a simple wordless lullaby he couldn't recognize. The sound was barely audible, drifting from the living room, thin and pure. And in that purity, there was something inexpressibly creepy. His gaze darted to the laptop screen. The white line of flower was untouched, absolutely perfect. The humming continued, growing louder, then softer, as if a child humming to itself was wandering around the living room. Arthur felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. Then the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. He kept his eyes glued to the screen, and suddenly he saw movement. In the far left corner of the flower line, right by the baseboard, a tiny disturbance appeared. A small cloud of flour rose into the air, as if from an invisible drop falling from the ceiling. But the ceiling was dry. Then, a few inches to the right, another such cloud appeared. And another. And another. Something was crossing the flower barrier. Something invisible and weightless that left no prints but still disturbed the space. It moved unhurriedly, crossing the hallway diagonally. The flower cloud stopped around the center of the hallway. Arthur realized, with a soul-chilling horror, that it was there now, standing in the darkness, between him and the living room. Invisible, silent, and it knew he was here. It had bypassed his trap. It was mocking him. And in that moment of absolute silence, a new sound came. Tap. A quiet, distinct knock. Tap, a tap, tap. It was coming from his bedroom door. The ajar door he was hiding behind. Someone or something was standing in the dark hallway and tapping on his door with the tip of a finger. The air in Arthur's lungs turned to ice. The man froze, becoming a statue of pure terror. His gaze was fixed on the crack of the ajar door, behind which lay the dark hallway. The laptop on his knees showed the same hallway, empty, still, innocent. But the knocking was real. It vibrated through the wood of the door, resonating in the bones of his skull. Tap-a-tap. The knocking wasn't aggressive. It was measured, curious. And that made it all the more terrifying. Like a child who knows you're hiding and has decided to play. Arthur held his breath. He was afraid the slightest exhale would give him away. He watched as nothing happened on the laptop screen, while simultaneously hearing reality diverge from the image. Something was there. The camera couldn't see it, but it was there. The knocking stopped. A silence fell, so profound he could hear the blood roaring in his ears. Slowly, agonizingly, he allowed himself to exhale. Maybe it had gone away. The door began to open. It moved inward, into his bedroom, silently and smoothly, with an unnatural slowness. The old hinges didn't make a single creak. The gap widened, revealing more and more of the dark hallway. Arthur scrambled backward, pressing his back against the cold wall. His attempt to lift the poker failed. His hands were trembling so badly that the heavy metal felt impossibly heavy. With the opening door, a chill swept into the room. Not a draft from a window, but a grave-like penetrating cold that seemed to suck the warmth out of the very air. The lamp on the bedside table flickered and dimmed. The laptop screen momentarily filled with static. The door stopped open about a foot. There was no one in the doorway. The hallway behind it was empty, but Arthur knew that it had entered. It was in the room with him. He heard a quiet, wet sigh very close, and then a giggle. A light, almost weightless child's giggle that held not a shred of joy. It was cold and mocking. His gaze darted around the room. Nothing, just the familiar furniture casting long shadows. And then he saw it. A paperback book, lying on the edge of his bedside table, began to slide slowly toward the edge. It didn't slip under its own weight. It was being pushed. It reached the edge and fell to the carpet with a soft thud. Arthur's heart hammered so hard it felt like it would break his ribs. This was a game. A cruel, sadistic game of hide-and-seek in which he was both the prey and the spectator. He shifted his gaze to the bed. The corner of his blanket, neatly tucked in that morning, lifted slightly, and then slowly, fold by fold, began to peel back as if an invisible hand were pulling it down. He saw the fabric tighten, saw it slide across the sheet, revealing the white surface of mattress. That was the last straw. The animal instinct for self-preservation overcame the paralyzing terror. He could no longer sit in this trap and wait to see what happened next. Letting out a choked, growl-like cry, Arthur scrambled to his feet. The laptop crashed to the floor. He didn't grab the poker. He just bolted forward toward the open door, into the dark hallway. He ran without looking, his only thought being away. He didn't look to the sides, afraid of what he might see. He just ran toward the saving light seeping from under the front door. He threw himself against the door, his fingers, numb with fear, refusing to obey, fumbling with the two locks and the chain. It felt like an eternity before he finally managed to work them. He wrenched the door open and stumbled out onto the landing, slamming it shut behind him. The slam echoed through the quiet building. He stood there, panting heavily, his back pressed against his apartment door. In his pajamas, barefoot, in the dim light of the stairwell. Outside? Safe? Probably. He stared at the peephole in his door, expecting to see it go dark, but nothing happened. Not a sound came from behind the door. He didn't go back that night. He couldn't. He went downstairs and spent the rest of the night in his car, flinching at every sound, at every shadow that flickered past the window. With the first rays of dawn, he saw his reflection in the rearview mirror, a haggard, pale face with eyes wide with terror. It was the face of a man on the brink of madness. He knew he couldn't call the police. What would he tell them? That an invisible child was playing hide-and-seek with him? They would send him for a psychiatric evaluation. He was on his own with this. He had to understand. The rational part of his brain, the part that still clung to order and logic, demanded an explanation. This couldn't have come from nowhere. Everything had to have a reason. A history. Later that day, unwashed, unshaven, in the same clothes as the day before, he wasn't in his office, but in the quiet, dusty hall of the city archives. Old newspaper binders and building registries lay before him. He was searching for information about his building, about his apartment. He felt insane, but it was the only thing he could do. Hours passed. He sifted through yellowed pages, inhaling the scent of old paper and glue, until his eyes began to ache. And just when he was ready to give up, he found it. A small notice in a local newspaper, dated November 1958. The headline was short, "Family Tragedy on Beacon Street." He skimmed the text, and his heart stopped. The article spoke of the Winters family, who lived in apartment 3B, his apartment, about an accident. Their 6-year-old son, Joshua, had drowned in the bathtub. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a rushing sound in his ears. Joshua, drowned, in the bathtub. The wet footprints. It all fell into place, forming a horrifying, impossible picture. He wasn't just in a haunted apartment. He was in an apartment with the ghost of a drowned child. The knowledge brought no relief. It brought a new, deeper, and clammier fear. Before, it had been a nameless something, an anomaly in his ordered world. Now the horror had a name. Joshua, 6 years old, drowned. Each word was a nail driven into the coffin of his rational mind. Arthur sat in the archives until closing time, until the attendant asked him to leave. He stepped out onto the street, squinting in the light of the evening's street lamps. The city was living its normal life. People hurried home, cars honked, couples laughed in cafes. This world seemed unreal, a cardboard set. His true reality was back there, on the 3rd floor of the brick building, in the apartment where time had stopped in 1958. He couldn't spend forever sleeping in his car. Selling the apartment was also out of the question. Who would buy a place inhabited by something like this? And how could he explain it? He was trapped. His sanctuary had become his prison, and the only way to survive was to face his jailer. Going back was harder than running away. Every step up the stairs echoed with a heavy beat of his heart. He inserted the key into the lock, and the metal felt like ice. The door opened with a quiet creak. Inside, everything was as he had left it in his panic. The spilled flour on the floor, like the chalk outline of a crime scene. The overturned laptop with its cracked screen. The same grave-like chill hung in the air, but now it was mixed with something else. Anticipation. As if the whole house were holding its breath, watching him. Arthur forced himself to act. He picked up the laptop, cleaned up the flour, put the book back in its place. He was trying to restore order, as if that could banish the chaos that had taken root within the walls. He turned on every light he could, chasing away the shadows. But he knew it was an illusion. The real darkness wasn't afraid of the light. In the kitchen, he poured himself a large glass of whiskey. His hands trembled so much that he spilled some on the counter. He downed the glass in one gulp, the alcohol burning his throat. It brought no warmth, but gave him a sliver of reckless courage. "All right," he said into the emptiness. His voice was hoarse. "All right, I know you're here." Silence. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Walking to the center of the living room, Arthur felt like an idiot, but he continued. "I know your name," he said louder. "Your name is Joshua." Spoken aloud, the name hung in the air, heavy and out of place. And in that moment, something changed. The ticking of the clock in the study stopped. Abruptly, an absolute, crushing silence fell. Arthur froze, listening. He heard a sound. Drip, 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 from the bathroom. He walked slowly toward the sound. The bathroom door was ajar. He pushed it open. It was dark inside. He didn't turn on the light, afraid of what he might see. Moonlight from the small window fell on the white enamel of the bathtub. The faucet above it was shut tight, but heavy measured drops were falling from its spout. Each one hit the empty tub with a hollow, unnaturally loud echo. He moved closer. At the bottom of the tub, where the drops were falling, a small puddle had formed. Arthur leaned over, and his breath caught. The water in the puddle wasn't just water. It was dark, almost black, and it gave off a faint, nauseating smell of rot and river mud. And then he saw movement. On the mirror above the sink, fogged from the cold, letters began to appear, as if an invisible finger were writing on the damp glass. They appeared slowly, one after another, and droplets of condensation ran down them like tears. COLD. Arthur recoiled, his back hitting the doorframe. It was a response. The first coherent response. Not a game, not a prank. A complaint. Instantly, water gushed from the faucet. Not drops, but a powerful icy torrent. It slammed into the bottom of the tub with a roar, and the black, foul-smelling liquid began to fill it rapidly. The light in the bathroom flickered violently, turning the scene into a strobe-lit nightmare. In the intermittent light, Arthur thought he saw something in the water, a small, dark silhouette beneath its surface. He screamed and bolted from the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. The sound of the water stopped immediately. Pressing his ear to the door, he heard only silence. Shaking, he returned to the living room. His courage had evaporated. He didn't want to talk anymore. He wanted it to stop. He sat in the armchair, wrapping his arms around himself, and began to rock back and forth like a child. He didn't know how long he sat like that, but suddenly he heard a new sound very close. The rustle of paper. Arthur lifted his head. On his desk in the study, which he hadn't entered, his blueprints were unrolling on their own. Large sheets of drafting paper slid off one another, falling to the floor one by one. His work, his order, his world, being destroyed before his eyes. He jumped to his feet. No, stop it. In response to his cry, the last largest drawing, the facade of a new building he had been working on for months, rose into the air. It hovered for a moment, and then it was slowly and deliberately crumpled, as if in an invisible fist. The balled-up sheet fell to the floor. And then, in the ensuing silence, came a whisper. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Not in his ears, but directly in his mind. A cold, wet, childlike whisper, full of infinite loneliness and hidden malice. "Nobody plays with me." Those words were not a threat. They were something worse. An invitation. A desperate, venomous plea from a lonely being, trapped for decades within four walls. The whisper faded, but its echo remained, vibrating in Arthur's skull, cold and insistent. He stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the crumpled blueprint that held months of his labor, and understood that the rules had changed. This was no longer an invasion. It was an attempt to establish contact, albeit in a monstrous, twisted way. Running was not an option. Fighting was pointless. There was only one thing left to do. Play. The fear hadn't gone away. It was coiled like a knot in his stomach. But on top of it settled a strange, icy calm. The calm of a man with nothing left to lose. His sanctuary had been defiled, his work destroyed. His mind stood on the edge of a precipice. He was in Joshua's territory, and now he would have to live by its laws. Arthur slowly sank to the floor. Not into the armchair, but onto the parquet, crossing his legs like a child ready for a bedtime story. He stared into the empty space before him. "All right, Joshua," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I'll play with you. The answer was silence. But it was different. The tension had eased. Anticipation had been replaced by curiosity. Arthur sat motionless, afraid to break this fragile, unthinkable pact. A minute passed. 2. And then he saw it. From the dark opening of the hallway leading to the bedroom, a glass marble slowly rolled out onto the moonlit parquet. It was old, with clouded colors inside, the kind Arthur had only seen in antique shops. It rolled silently, with an unnatural smoothness, and stopped exactly in the middle of the room, a few feet away from him. It was the first move. Arthur stared at the marble, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? Pick it up? Roll it back? There were no instructions for this game. Any wrong move could have catastrophic consequences. He remembered the child's laugh he had heard in the bedroom. Cold and mocking. Joshua didn't want a fair game. He wanted power. He wanted a reaction. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, Arthur leaned forward. He didn't touch the marble. Instead, he extended his index finger and flicked it lightly, the way children play. The marble rolled back into the darkness of the hallway and disappeared. Arthur held his breath. He had made his move. A few seconds passed, and a sound came from the darkness. A quick, scratching clatter, as if the marble were bouncing off the walls. And then it shot back into the room, no longer rolling. It flew through the air, spinning, and struck the wall next to Arthur's head with force. A small dent was left on the wallpaper. A quiet giggle was heard. This time, it had something resembling amusement in it. The game was getting more dangerous. Arthur didn't move. He understood. This was a test of his fear. If he jumped up, screamed, tried to run, he would lose. Arthur's gaze darted back to the hallway. This time, something else slid out. A small tin soldier, with paint peeling from its uniform. It slid across the floor and stopped next to the marble. And behind it, another. And another. A whole army of toys from the past, materializing out of nowhere, silently crawled out of the darkness. Alphabet blocks, a small wooden rocking horse, a spinning top. They surrounded him, forming a silent circle. Arthur sat in the center of this circle of forgotten children's treasures. The cold intensified. Each toy radiated an icy indifference. And then they began to move. Slowly, altogether, they began to shift toward him, tightening the circle. The horse rocked silently. The top spun without a hum. The blocks turned over, and he saw the letters that were facing him. M-I-N-E. N-O-W. The circle was closing in. The tin soldiers were already at his knees. The wooden horse was pressing against his back. He was trapped. He could feel panic rising again from the depths of his soul, threatening to consume him. He had to make a move. But what? His gaze fell on the blocks. Mine? No. It wasn't just a statement. It was a condition. He looked at his hands. The hands of an architect, creating order from chaos. In this world, his skills were useless. He had to learn another language. The language of Joshua's game. He reached out and picked up one of the blocks. It was as cold as a piece of ice from a morgue. He turned it. The letter M changed to it. Then he took another block. And another. He began to rearrange them, just as he did with blueprints, creating a new configuration. N-O-T-A-L-O-N-E. He leaned back, breathing heavily. He had changed the message. He had answered. For a moment, everything froze. The toys stopped moving. The cold seemed to grow even stronger, almost unbearable. He felt unseen eyes studying him, studying his work. Had he broken a rule? Had he lost? And then he heard it. Not a laugh, not a whisper. A quiet sobbing sound. The cry of a small, lonely child coming from the dark hallway. It was the sound of crushing grief, which pierced Arthur to the core, more terrifying than any scream. The toys around him crumbled to dust. Not ordinary dust, but a gray, damp ash that immediately soaked into the parquet floor, leaving no trace. Arthur was left alone in the empty room. The crying stopped. He had won this round. But the price of victory was terrible. He had made a ghost cry, and he had no idea what would follow a child's tears. The silence that followed the crying was worse than any scream. It was heavy, saturated with grief, like an old sponge with water. Arthur remained sitting on the floor, the air around him feeling dense and cold. He felt no triumph from his small victory. On the contrary, he felt like a monster. A grown man had brought the spirit of a dead, lonely child to tears. The thought was both absurd and unbearably real. Nothing else happened that night. No footsteps, no laughter, no games. But Arthur couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and the silence pressed down on him, suffocating him. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the tragedy whose echoes still resonated within these walls. A boy named Joshua had died here, alone, in cold water. And he was still here, alone and cold. The next few days passed in a strange, oppressive lull. Arthur stopped trying to live his old life. He called work and said he was sick, not knowing if he would ever return. His world had shrunk to the size of this apartment. He wandered through the rooms, like a ghost in his own home, constantly listening. The atmosphere had changed. The malice was gone, replaced by an all-pervading melancholy. The apartment began to weep. Small puddles of clear, cold water would appear in the corners of rooms for no reason, only to dry up without a trace. Thin streams of condensation ran down the inside of the window panes, even on clear days. The air became constantly damp and cool, with a faint smell of ozone after a rainstorm. The parquet floor always felt slightly damp underfoot. It was subtle, but inescapable. The apartment was drowning in grief. Arthur found himself talking to the emptiness. "I'm sorry, Joshua," he would whisper, wiping up another puddle. "I didn't mean to hurt you." There was no response, but it seemed to him that the chill in the room became slightly less piercing. He began leaving things for him, not as traps, but as offerings. He bought a pack of new glass marbles and left them on the floor in the hallway. The next morning, they were gone. He found and ordered an exact replica of a tin soldier, the kind made in the 50s. He placed it on the mantelpiece. An hour later, the soldier was lying on its side, like a tired sentry. This became their new ritual, their new silent game. He was trying to atone for his actions, and Joshua seemed to accept his apologies, but the distance remained. And then a new shift occurred. One morning, Arthur woke up to find an old photograph on his pillow, next to his head. He recognized it immediately. It was a picture from his own childhood album, which had been gathering dust in a closet for decades. In the faded photo was himself, 6 years old, smiling with a gap-toothed grin and holding a small toy boat. Exactly the same age as Joshua when he died. The photograph was soaking wet. It was dripping. Arthur sat up in bed, holding his wet past in his hands. This was no longer a game. This was a direct, personal contact. Joshua didn't just see him. He understood him. He was drawing a parallel between them. "You were like this once. You were alone, too." That evening, he was drawn to the bathroom. There were no sounds, no compulsion, just an inner feeling that he had to go there. The door was closed. He reached for the handle, and it was icy, burning with cold. He opened the door. The bathtub was filled to the brim, not with the black, rotting sludge from before. The water was crystal clear, and absolutely still, like a mirror. On its surface, perfectly in the center, floated a small wooden boat, an exact replica of the one in his photograph. Arthur froze in the doorway, mesmerized. The scene was quiet, almost peaceful. He took a step inside, and the moment his foot touched the tile, the water in the tub stirred. It overflowed, not in a thin trickle, but in a powerful, silent flood. It poured onto the floor, cold as meltwater. Arthur stepped back, but it was too late. The stream flowed around his feet and rushed from the bathroom into the hallway. It didn't stop. Water continued to pour from the tub, which, defying all laws of physics, did not empty. The water level on the floor rose with terrifying speed. It was already up to his ankles. The cold chilled him to the bone. Arthur backed away down the hallway, watching as the dark, mirror-like surface of the water consumed his apartment. His world. It flooded the parquet, creeping up the legs of the furniture. This wasn't just a flood. It was a submersion. He ran to the living room and jumped onto the sofa. The water had already covered the entire floor, turning his apartment into a dark, shallow lake. Everything fell silent. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. The still water reflected the ceiling and the dim light of a lamp, creating the illusion of an upside-down world. He was trapped. He sat on his sofa as if on an island in the middle of an ocean of grief. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Joshua didn't want to play anymore. He wanted Arthur to feel what it was like to drown. Time stood still. Arthur sat huddled on the sofa, his island of safety in a sea of unnatural silence. The water was like black glass, perfectly reflecting the ceiling and the lone lamp. In this inverted world, he was the only flaw, an incorrect shape disrupting the symmetry. The cold emanating from the water was not just a physical sensation. It seeped into his bones, into his soul. It was the cold of loneliness and oblivion. Arthur looked down, afraid to peer into the depths, yet unable to look away. Beneath the dark surface, he saw the distorted outlines of his world. Expensive Persian rugs, swollen and dark. Books, floating like dead birds with waterlogged pages. His vinyl record collection, his pride and passion, lay at the bottom like the sunken treasures of a cursed ship. Everything that constituted his ordered life had been drowned, desecrated, consumed by another's grief. Suddenly, something slid beneath the water. A long, dark shadow flashed under his feet. Arthur jerked his legs up, his heart pounding in his throat. It was something more than just distorted furniture. It was moving with purpose. And then he heard a voice. It didn't come from the hallway or the corners of the room. It rose from the water. A gurgling, distorted sound, as if someone were trying to speak while choking underwater. Play. The word was drawn out, drowned in gurgles, but the meaning was clear. It was a demand. Arthur gripped the sofa's upholstery, his knuckles white. He desperately looked around for an escape route. The windows. They faced the street, 3 stories down. The door. It was somewhere over there, under a foot of icy water. He was completely cut off from the world. Looking at the water again, Arthur saw something that made him scream. A quiet, choked gasp escaped his lips. In the reflection on the water, directly beneath him, he saw a face. Pale, blurry, it stared up at him from the depths. It had no features, only 2 dark, empty pits for eyes. It was there, beneath him, in his own reflection, like a drowning man chained to his feet. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head, trying to banish the vision. When he opened them again, the face was gone. But the terror remained, and the water began to rise. He felt it before he saw it. A cold, wet line crept up the legs of the sofa. He watched as the dark edge of the water slowly, inexorably, approached the cushions. It wasn't a fast torrent. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. The apartment was turning into an aquarium, and he was its only inhabitant who needed air. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced him. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the water to consume him. Objects began to surface from the depths. His life, returning to him in a twisted form. A picture frame with a photo of his parents floated up, face down. His favorite pen, which he used to sign blueprints. And there, the small wooden boat that had started all this. It drifted slowly toward the sofa, like a messenger. The boat stopped a foot away from him. And right behind it, a hand slowly emerged from the water. Small, white, almost translucent. The fingers were slender, and the skin looked swollen and wrinkled from being in the water for a long time. The hand wasn't threatening. It was beckoning. The slender fingers slowly curled and uncurled, inviting him to join, inviting him into the water. The water touched the edge of the sofa cushion. Arthur felt its icy touch through the fabric of his pants. He understood. This was the next move. The only possible move in this monstrous game. He couldn't stay on his island. He had to get off it. He had to enter the water. Into Joshua's world. He looked at the beckoning hand, then at the rising water that was already soaking his clothes. His rational mind screamed that it was suicide, that it was madness. But logic no longer held any power here. There were only the rules of the game. And the rule was simple. Either he entered the water himself, or the water would come for him. Taking a deep, ragged breath that burned his lungs with the cold, damp air, Arthur slowly, as if in a dream, began to slide off the sofa. He didn't take his eyes off the small white hand. Trembling, he lowered one leg, and his bare foot touched the icy, still surface of the black water. The touch was a shock. The water wasn't just cold. It was the embodiment of cold, an icy void that seemed to suck out not warmth, but life itself. It didn't feel like water. It was heavy, viscous, like liquid nitrogen or mercury, and it pulled him down with an unnatural force. As soon as his foot was submerged to the ankle, he felt a numbness creep up his skin, paralyzing his muscles. The small white hand wiggled its fingers impatiently. Arthur forced himself to lower his other leg. Now he was standing knee-deep in this dark substance that was his apartment. The sofa behind him seemed like a lifeboat drifting away into infinity. He took a step forward, then another, moving toward the beckoning hand. Each step required a titanic effort, as if he were walking against a powerful current in thick syrup. The water rose to his waist. It pressed on him, trying to constrict his chest, to force the air from his lungs. Trembling, he reached out his hand toward the child's hand. Their fingers almost touched. The contact was like a discharge of static electricity, only instead of a spark, there was an explosion of cold that shot through him to his spine. And in that moment, the small hand grabbed him. The grip was weak, yet tenacious, like that of a drowning person, and it pulled him down. Arthur lost his balance. He was dragged under the water with a force a child could not possess. The dark surface closed over his head. He instinctively tried to scream, but instead, his mouth filled with the viscous, icy liquid. Panic exploded in his chest. He was suffocating. His lungs burned. He struggled, but the small hand held him in a death grip, pulling him deeper and deeper into a place that was much larger than his living room. Just as he was on the verge of losing consciousness, when black spots danced before his eyes, everything changed. The pressure vanished. His lungs took a convulsive breath, but not of water, of cool ozone-scented air. Breathing returned. Arthur opened his eyes. He was still underwater, but this was no longer his apartment. He was standing on the parquet floor in the center of a room filled with a dim, ethereal light, its source unclear. The water around him was crystal clear, and through it he could see the room's furnishings. It was the same living room, but different. Floral wallpaper, a bulky sofa covered with a throw blanket, a round television in the corner with a crochet doily on top. The apartment from 1958. His apartment, as it had been when Joshua was alive. And Joshua himself stood before him. He was no longer a hand or a shadow. He was here, a small boy in light-colored pajamas. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a bluish tint, like a drowning victim. Wet dark hair was plastered to his forehead. But the most terrifying thing was his eyes. They were huge, dark, and deep like wells, and there was nothing childish in them. They held the wisdom and pain of centuries spent in solitude. He didn't look evil. He looked infinitely, crushingly sad. He let go of Arthur's hand. "You came," the voice sounded directly in Arthur's mind. It no longer gurgled. It was clear, quiet, and cold. "You came to play." Arthur couldn't speak. He just nodded, his body numb from cold and shock. Joshua didn't smile. His face remained a motionless mask of grief. He pointed a slender, white finger toward the corner of the room, at the door of a built-in closet. It was old, painted a cream color, with peeling paint and a brass handle. "He took it," the voice said, "when I fell asleep in the water. He came and took my boat. The other one. The real one." Arthur frowned, not understanding. "What other boat? Who was he?" "He comes when the light goes out," Joshua continued, and for the first time a note of fear entered his mental voice. "He lives in the dark, behind the door. He doesn't like it when people play. He takes the toys." The closet door the boy was pointing at slowly began to creak open, a sound Arthur felt more than heard. No light or darkness poured from the crack. A vacuum poured from it. A sense of absolute emptiness and wrongness that made the hair on the back of Arthur's neck stand on end. "Get it back," Joshua commanded. His dark eyes bored into Arthur. "Go in there. Find my boat. And bring it back to me." Arthur looked at the ajar door, from which a sense of non-existence emanated, and realized that this was not just a closet. It was something else. A place no living person should ever look into. "I can't," he thought, and terror seized him. "You have to," Joshua's voice replied, and now there was steel in it. "Or you will stay here. With me. We will play hide-and-seek. Forever." The threat was absolute. Arthur looked at the boy, at his ancient, sad eyes, and realized that Joshua was not the only prisoner in this apartment. He was afraid of something, too. Something that lived behind that door. The world around him began to flicker. The 1950s furnishings became transparent, and through them, Arthur could see the outlines of his own submerged furniture. Two worlds were overlapping. "Go," the voice whispered one last time, and Arthur was violently thrown upward. He burst out of the water with a deafening splash and a convulsive gasp, collapsing onto something solid. He coughed, spitting out water that wasn't there, his body racked with uncontrollable shivers. He was lying on the wet floor of his living room. But the water was gone. The apartment was completely dry. The carpets, the books, the records, everything was in its place, untouched, as if there had been no flood at all. He lay there, trembling, trying to process what had happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? He rolled onto his back. His clothes were soaked through, and on the parquet floor where he lay, a puddle of clear, cold water was spreading. He sat up, wrapping his arms around himself. Then he saw it. In the center of the puddle, where his heart had been a moment ago, lay a small object that hadn't been there before. An old, tarnished brass key to a closet. The key lay in the puddle, gleaming dully in the lamplight. It wasn't just wet. It was cold with the same otherworldly chill as the water Arthur had been drowning in. This cold didn't fade. It had seeped into the metal like radiation. Arthur sat on the floor, trembling, staring at the key. It was an anchor, tying him to the nightmare he had just emerged from. Proof that the sunken world was real. That Joshua was real. And that his directive was not a delusion, but a deadly serious assignment. Hours passed before he could force himself to move. The shivering gradually subsided, replaced by a heavy, leaden exhaustion. He got to his feet, his wet clothes clinging to his body. The puddle on the floor was slowly evaporating, like all the other traces of Joshua's presence. But the key remained. Leaning down, he picked it up. The cold burned his fingers, but he didn't let go. The key was heavy real. The number 3 was engraved on its head. Just 3. Arthur clenched it in his fist, and the metal seemed to suck the warmth directly from his blood. Get it back. Go in there. Joshua's words echoed in his head. Arthur knew which door the boy had been talking about. In his living room, in a far corner he used for storing junk, was an old built-in closet. He rarely opened it. The door was heavy, and the lock had been jammed for a long time. The previous tenants had apparently lost the key. Arthur had never paid it any mind. It was just a closet. Now he looked at it, and the mundane piece of furniture had transformed into a sinister monolith. The door, painted the same color as the walls, seemed darker than the surrounding space, as if it were absorbing light. He approached it, and the cold intensified. The air near the door was several degrees lower. Arthur did not want to do this. Every cell in his body screamed of danger. He remembered the feeling of vacuum, of wrongness, that had emanated from the ajar door in his vision. Joshua, the ghost of a drowned child who had terrorized him for weeks, was himself afraid of what was behind this door. What could possibly be in there that frightened the dead? But he also remembered the other threat. Or you will stay here, with me, forever. The choice was between terror and an endless nightmare. He had to at least try. He wiped his sweaty palm on his pants and inserted the key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly, without the slightest wobble. Arthur took a deep breath and turned it. There was a click. Not loud, but so dry and final that it seemed to fracture the very silence in the apartment. The sound of a tomb being unlocked. Arthur froze, waiting. Nothing happened. He grasped the cold brass handle. It was smooth and slick with condensation that had formed on it. He pulled. The door yielded without a creak. It opened into an absolute, impenetrable darkness. This wasn't just the shadow inside a closet. This was a darkness that had weight and texture. It didn't reflect the light from the room, but seemed to suck it in. Not just cold air, but a torrent of absolute cold flowed from the opening, forcing him to step back. And the smell. An ancient, dry smell of thousand-year-old dust, decayed fabric, and something else, something metallic and bitter, like old blood. He peered inside. He expected to see a back wall, hangers, old junk. But there was nothing. Only endless, velvety blackness. It had no depth. It was flat and yet infinite. Taking out his phone, he turned on the flashlight. The bright beam of light shot into the darkness and vanished. It didn't reflect off a back wall, didn't illuminate anything. It simply drowned in the blackness, like a beam of light aimed into space. A meter from the door, the cone of light was cut off, swallowed by the darkness. And then he heard a sound. It wasn't music, not a voice, but rather an absence of sound that pressed on his eardrums. An anti-sound. And through it, at the very edge of perception, came a quiet, dry rustling, as if something huge, made of parchment and old bones, were stirring in that endless void. The fear he had felt before, the fear of Joshua, of drowning, was nothing compared to this. This was a primal terror of something that should not exist, of a wrongness in the very fabric of the universe. He takes the toys. Arthur understood. Joshua wasn't the source of evil in this apartment. He was just a terrified warden. And the real monster lived here, in this pocket of non-space, locked behind the door of an ordinary closet. And he, Arthur Penhaligon, architect, a man of logic and order, had just opened the door for it. He stood on the threshold, gazing into the abyss. And the abyss, he could feel it, was gazing back. The door remained open. Arthur wanted to slam it shut, lock it, board it up, and never look its way again. But he couldn't. His feet seemed to have grown roots into the parquet floor. He was paralyzed, hypnotized by that perfect, hungry darkness. He understood that closing the door now would change nothing. It knew he was here. It had been awakened. Get it back. Joshua's voice in his head was faint, almost drowned out by the oppressive silence emanating from the closet. But it held a desperate insistence. Taking a step back, Arthur whispered aloud, his voice pathetic and thin, "No, I can't." In response, the same dry rustle came from the darkness, closer this time, and with it a new smell. The smell of forgotten things, of dusty attics, abandoned basements, old photographs that no one would ever look at again. The smell of oblivion. Suddenly, the light bulb in the living room flickered violently and went out with a soft pop. The apartment was plunged into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the distant streetlights. He comes when the light goes out. Panic began to flood his mind. He couldn't stay here. The man scrambled for the front door, but his legs got tangled and he fell to the floor. He crawled, desperately, like a wounded animal. He reached the door, his fingers fumbling for the locks. They wouldn't budge. He pulled, twisted, but they were as if welded shut. He was locked in the dark with an open door to nothingness. Suddenly, he heard a quiet child's giggle behind him. Not malicious like before. Frightened, Arthur slowly turned around. In the center of the room, in a sliver of dim light from the window, stood Joshua, the transparent, shimmering silhouette of the boy in pajamas. He wasn't looking at Arthur. He was staring at the open closet, and his small, ghostly body was trembling. "He's angry," Joshua's voice whispered in his consciousness. "You woke him up. Now he'll take everything." Arthur followed his gaze. The darkness in the closet seemed to have thickened. It began to slowly, like black molasses, ooze from the opening, forming a spreading puddle of absolute blackness on the floor. It didn't reflect light. It devoured it. And from that puddle, something began to rise. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It had no form that the human mind could comprehend. It was a shifting geometry of shadows, of angles that shouldn't exist, and lines that bent the space around them. It was tall and thin, like an old, withered tree. It was composed of shadows, dust, and despair. It rustled and scraped with its every non-movement. Arthur realized he was looking at the collector of forgotten things. The thing that lives in corners, under beds, and behind locked doors. An eternal hunger that feeds on lost memories. The creature slowly turned what should have been its head toward Arthur. It had no face, but Arthur felt its attention on him, dry and different, like the gaze of an insect. It had come for him. And in that moment, Arthur knew he had no choice. There was nowhere to run. There was nothing to fight. The only path lay forward. Through the fear. Through that door. Arthur forced himself to his trembling feet. His gaze fell on Joshua. The ghost of the boy was looking at him with his bottomless eyes, in which, for the first time, a shadow of hope had appeared. Arthur turned away from the front door and walked toward the closet. He walked toward the shadow that was slowly forming on his floor. He didn't know what he was going to do. He had no plan. He only had the key in his pocket, the flashlight on his phone, and a desperate, insane resolve. He would not be the prey. He would be the hunter. He took one last step and crossed the threshold. The world vanished. The sensation was not like falling, but like an instantaneous and complete erasure. Sound, light, temperature, even the feeling of his own body, everything disappeared. For a fraction of a second, Arthur ceased to exist. He was just a point of consciousness in an absolute nothingness. And then his senses returned, but distorted, wrong. Arthur was standing on something solid, but it wasn't wood beneath his feet. The surface was dry, brittle, and slightly uneven, as if he were standing on a thick layer of compressed dust or ash. The air was still and odorless, but it pressed on his lungs, as if it were too dense to breathe. He turned on the flashlight on his phone. The beam, as before, found no obstacle. It stretched into an infinite blackness, illuminating only particles of dust suspended in the air, not falling, but hanging in space like stars in a dead galaxy. He took a step. There was no sound. His foot landed on the dusty floor in complete silence. He took another step. Silence. There's no echo here. No reflection. Sound was born and died instantly, absorbed by the void. This was the realm of entropy, a place where everything tended toward zero. He, an architect, a man whose life was dedicated to form and structure, found himself in a place devoid of both. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor in the conventional sense. There was only a down direction, pulled by a weak, barely perceptible gravity, and an infinite forward. He walked. He didn't know where he was going, but standing still was even more terrifying. He walked, holding the flashlight beam in front of him, his only guide in this non-place. The journey seemed to take a few minutes, but it could have been hours. Time was also distorted here. Gradually, his eyes began to adjust, and he realized that this was not just emptiness. Vague shapes loomed around him in the darkness. Huge, towering piles of things. Approaching closer, Arthur shone his flashlight. They were mountains of what people lose. Not just physical objects, but the concepts themselves. He saw a hill made of single socks that had lost their pairs. Next to it, a mountain of keys to long-sold houses. There was a pile of glasses that had slipped off a face and fallen into the grass, never to be found. There were stacks of unread letters, forgotten names, unfulfilled promises. All of it lay here, covered in a layer of gray, lifeless dust. And over it all reigned that same quiet, dry rustling. The collector was here, somewhere in the darkness, sifting through its treasures. Arthur walked on, through these surreal landscapes of the lost. He felt the place pressing in on him, trying to take his memories too. He forced himself to think about his life, his work, the smell of coffee in the morning, clinging to these details like a lifeline. The boat. The real one. He had to find it. But how could he search for one small toy in this infinity? He stopped, trying to listen. But there were no sounds here but the rustling and the dull thud of his own heart. He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. Joshua was a child. His toy had to be connected to emotions, to joy, to play. And this place was devoid of emotion. Maybe he shouldn't be searching with his eyes. He turned off the flashlight. The darkness closed in around him, absolute and all-consuming. Panic momentarily tightened its grip on his throat, but he forced himself to calm down. He stretched his hands out in front of him and walked blindly. His fingers touched something. He had stumbled upon one of the piles. He began to sift through the things by touch. The cold metal of keys, the soft wool of socks, the smooth plastic of buttons. They were all equally dead, devoid of energy. He went from pile to pile, plunging his hands into the dusty oblivion. It was nauseating. He felt his own history thinning with every touch of these dead things. And suddenly, he found it. A mountain of children's toys. Broken dolls with empty eye sockets, tin soldiers without heads, teddy bears with their stuffing ripped out. Toys that had been broken and thrown away. Toys that had been lost. He began to dig through them, and his heart beat faster. It had to be here. His fingers brushed against something wooden. Smooth, streamlined. He pulled the object out. Even in complete darkness, he recognized it. A small boat, carved from a single piece of wood. It didn't look like the one Joshua had shown him in the bathroom. This one was cruder, made with love, but unskillfully. A father's work for his son. And it wasn't dead. Unlike everything else in this place, the boat was warm. A faint, living warmth emanated from it. And when Arthur clenched it in his hand, he heard a quiet, distant laugh in his head. Not the ghostly laugh of Joshua, but the real, vibrant laugh of a child playing in a bathtub. He had found it. In that same instant, the silence exploded. The dry rustling, which had been mere background noise, became a deafening roar. It was everywhere, coming from all sides. The collector knew something had been stolen from it. Without a second thought, Arthur bolted. He didn't know where, he just ran from that all-consuming sound. He stumbled, fell, got up, and ran again, tightly clutching the warm boat in his hand. Behind him, the darkness came alive. He didn't dare to look back, but he could feel something huge, something that violated the laws of physics, hurtling after him. He ran, choking on dust and terror, and suddenly saw a dim rectangle of light ahead. The door. The exit. He poured all his remaining strength into a final sprint. He flew toward the light, the roar and rustle now right at his back. He could feel the cold breath of oblivion on the nape of his neck. He leaped out of the darkness and crashed onto the familiar oak parquet of his living room with a thud. The closet door slammed shut behind him with such force that cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. The lock clicked. Arthur lay on the floor, gasping for breath, covered in gray dust. The apartment was flooded with morning light. In his hand, he held a small, warm wooden boat in a death grip. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed unnaturally bright, almost painful. Arthur lay on the floor, every muscle in his body screaming with tension. The gray dust covering him was unlike ordinary house dust. It was dry, like ash, and smelled of centuries. He slowly uncurled his fingers. The small wooden boat lay in his palm, emitting a faint but distinct warmth. It was the only warm thing he could feel. Arthur struggled to sit up. The apartment was quiet. Not the ominous waiting silence he had grown used to, but a simple, ordinary morning silence. The sounds of the city drifted in from the street, but they seemed distant, as if from another world. He looked at the closet door. It was closed. The cracks in the wall around it looked like scars. He was not alone. In the center of the room, in a pillar of sunlight, stood Joshua. He was no longer shimmering. He seemed almost solid, real. And he wasn't looking at Arthur. All his attention was fixed on the small boat in Arthur's hand. His dark eyes no longer held an age-old sorrow. They held only a child's desperate longing. Arthur slowly got to his feet. His fear of the boy was gone. There was only a deep, all-consuming exhaustion and a strange sense of kinship. He took a step, then another, and held out his hand with the boat. Joshua took a hesitant step toward him. His ghostly fingers, pale and translucent, reached for the toy. The moment he touched the warm wood, a wave passed through the room. It wasn't a sound. It was pure emotion. A wave of warmth, light, and memory. For one dazzling instant, the apartment vanished. Arthur found himself in a sun-drenched bathroom from the past. He heard the splash of water, the deep, kind laughter of a man, and the bright, happy laugh of a child. He saw large, calloused hands lowering a small wooden boat into the water, and tiny childish hands reaching for it. It was a second of pure, unadulterated happiness. The last happy second of Joshua's life. The vision vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Arthur was once again standing in his living room. The boat was now in Joshua's hands. The boy looked at it, and for the first time, something like a smile appeared on his face. Faint, sad, but real. The bluish tint of his skin was gone. It was now just pale. He looked like an ordinary little boy who had been woken up too early. "Thank you." The voice in Arthur's head was no longer cold and wet. It was quiet, like the rustle of leaves. "No, I can finish my game." He raised his dark eyes to Arthur, and they no longer held any malice or demand. Only peace. And then he began to disappear. Not melting or dissolving. His body broke apart into myriads of tiny golden sparks, like dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. They swirled in the air, rising higher and streamed toward the window. For a moment, the whole room was filled with a warm, soft light. And then it was over. Arthur was alone. A true silence descended upon the apartment. For the first time in many weeks, he was completely alone in it. The oppressive chill was gone. The smell of dampness was no more. The footsteps had stopped. It was all over. Walking to the mirror in the hallway, he looked at himself. A stranger looked back at him. A man who looked 10 years older, with deep shadows under his eyes that held the echo of the abyss he had seen. A lock of his hair, just above his temple, had turned completely white, as if touched by the very ash from the realm of oblivion. Returning to the living room, Arthur went to the closet. He reached for the handle. The door was locked. He put his hand in his pocket, searching for the key. His pockets were empty. The key that unlocked the darkness was gone, having returned to wherever it came from. Arthur slowly sank into his armchair. The sun shone on his face. He closed his eyes. He had won back his apartment. He had won back his silence. But he knew he would never be the same again. He had defeated a ghost, but he had peeked behind the curtain of reality and seen what was hiding there. He had learned that there are places where order and logic do not apply. Places that are hungry. The silence he had so loved was no longer a symbol of control and peace for him. Now it was just a lull. A pause. It was filled not with the size of an old house, but with a memory of a dry, parchment-like rustling. He opened his eyes and looked at the locked closet door. He was free, but he had become a keeper of the silence, behind which an eternal hunger lurked. And he knew that for the rest of his days, he would be listening not for footsteps in the hallway, but to the silence itself, afraid of hearing the familiar rustle of that which waits patiently behind a locked door for something, once again, to be lost.